Thank you very much, Janet, and thank you very much to the Tax Justice Network for allowing this panel. In this panel, we will be talking about the impact of tax policies on fiscal space and of public services. This panel will explore the reasons why tax justice is critical to the fulfillment of the right to education and indeed to the achievement of Sustainable Development Goal 4. The presentations will outline some of the challenges different developing countries' governments face in adequately financing essential public services such as education. They will also look at ways in which government could address these challenges through fair and progressive tax reforms, which could help raise the funds they need to meet or exceed global education financing benchmarks and move closer to delivering free, quality, inclusive public education by 2030. The panelists will be, it should have been David Archer, but unfortunately he cannot be with me, so I will be sharing on his behalf. Then we have Dennis Sinyolo from Education International, Evelyn Kabenge Muendo, excuse me, from the East African Tax and Governance Network, and Yandura Chipeta from ActionAid. So since David cannot be here, I will be presenting on his behalf. I'm going to be sharing the screen. Okay. Like this. So when we are talking about financing public services, particularly public education, where should the money come from? So I have introduced David Archer, who cannot be here, who is the head of public services in ActionAid. And my name is Maria Balsera, and I'm the Tax and Education Alliance Coordinator. This is an alliance between the Global Alliance for Tax Justice Network, ActionAid, Education International, and the Global Campaign for Education. What we are proposing is that when we are looking at tax justice, as well as looking at the revenue that can be raised in a progressive manner, we should also be talking about the spending, how this revenue should be spent in terms of the policies and interventions, in terms of decision-making, in terms of the balance between debt and public services, and looking at the share, size, sensitivity, and scrutiny of the budget. And this is a broader conception of tax justice that we think is really relevant. So how do tax policies, fiscal space affect public services? The provision of gender-responsive public services is key to deliver on human rights and to transforming women's life, particularly quality provision of early childcare, public education, health, and water. However, all around the world, and particularly in low-income countries, public services have been chronically underfunded for decades. This has left countries unable to deliver on people's rights. And that means that we are way off target for achieving the Sustainable Development Goals. And this has been particularly noticeable that in the pandemic, that in the COVID-19 pandemic, because it has left countries unable to respond effectively. Those fighting for more funding for public services often fight against each other for a greater share of a small pie. So you would normally see people fighting for a higher allocation for health or for education, but rather than fighting against each other, we should be working together to address these strategic financing issues. And particularly important is the action on debt, austerity, and tax in order to deliver a system change for all public services. We are living a new debt crisis, which is squeezing public spending, particularly in low and middle income countries, and things are getting worse. Countries who spend more than 12% of their budget in debt repayment services are invariably forced to cut their spending on public services. And the research that we conducted last year in the Who Cares report was looking into how much countries were paying into debt repayment services. And some of them were actually using 50% of the budget for this. And whenever we saw that they were using more than 12% of the budget in debt repayment services, the education budget and the health budget went down considerably. However, the International Monetary Fund holds down public spending by imposing unnecessarily low inflation targets, although they claim to have moved away from the austerity narrative, now they call it fiscal consolidation, and rather than making it an obligation, it becomes a recommendation. But again, in our research, it shows that 80% of the countries had recommendations for low inflation targets, and deficit targets were in 96% of the countries studied, and freezing or cutting public sector wage bills was recommended in 78% of the countries. So this means that most governments cannot employ more teachers, doctors, nurses, or care workers. What we recommend is for governments to resist this ideology of austerity and privatization, because what they need to do is to invest urgently in public sector workers, especially doctors, nurses, teachers, and care workers. We need to build societies and economies that care for both people and the planet. And this is the study that you get, the research, who cares for the future. So if we actually focus on education and financing for education, we see that even before COVID-19, there was a chronic underfunding. The average education budget in low-income countries was 17%, when the target is supposed to be a minimum of 20%. However, this hides some disparities in terms of education spending, particularly percentage of the government, as well as per capita spending. And you can see some of that in the table on the right. There was already a growing teacher gap, estimated to be at least 69 million. There was a financing gap, estimated to be $39 billion. And this was assuming that that countries, low and middle income countries would be raising up their expenditure from $1.2 trillion per year to $3 trillion per year. And most of this funding should be coming from domestic resource mobilization. This is at least 97%. However, we are focusing on this 3% that would be coming from aid and loans, and seems to be shaping all the policies. We also saw that debt servicing has been increasing and is actually eating away the budget for public services, particularly education. If things were bad then before COVID, COVID has some really dark consequences, because what we have seen that government revenues have been falling, that health and safety nets have been rightly prioritized, but at the expense of education in many cases. We have seen that there are increased levels of debt and poverty, and there have been budget cuts and regressions. And this is at a time when we actually need extra resources to keep and make schools safe, to reach the growing number of disadvantaged children who otherwise will never return to education, to reduce and eliminate the growing education inequalities brought by the pandemic, and to actually pay for the extra resources needed for remote learning and the technology needed to continue education during lockdowns. And for that, we need to increase in the 4 S's of the budget. And the 4 S's are: the share of the budget spent on education should be at least 20% of the national budget, or 6% of the GDP. The size of the government revenues overall, and this should be done by progressive tax reform, direct taxes, taxes to multinational companies, and by not giving harmful tax incentive, also taxes on wealth, and adequately taxing technological companies. But we also need to be looking at the sensitivity of the allocation, particularly within the education budget, because this allocation should be having an equity criteria, and the budget should be gender and inclusive responsive budgets. Once the allocations are there, the scrutiny is particularly important, because this is needed to ensure that the money arrives in practice. And for that, civil society organizations, teachers' unions, teachers Everyone should be able to track those budgets, particularly in disadvantaged areas. So we need to raise awareness and build capacity at all levels. And we also need to make the budgets more transparent and participatory. I am the coordinator of the TaxAid Alliance, and our aim is to sustainably increase the domestic financing of public education systems so developing countries can achieve the SDG 4. As I said, this is an alliance between the Global Alliance for Tax Justice, particularly its regional networks in the Tax Justice Network Africa, and the Asia Pacific Movement on Debt and Development, Tax Justice Network, ActionAid, Education International, Global Campaign for Education, and National Education Coalitions. We network CSOs, stakeholders working on tax issues as well as education to create an effective transnational CSO response. We also integrate the voices of poor and marginalized communities with national level CSOs, such as the teachers unions, national education coalitions, and tax justice alliances. And we support the coordination and engagement in key spaces at sub-regional, regional, and global levels. So in terms of our conclusions, and this goes not only for education, but also for other public services, is that we need to collaborate to strengthen advocacy capacity to enable inclusive, innovative cross-sector policy dialogue and strategic policy change on tax revenues and public services budgets. We need to be working together to address the strategic financing issues, particularly focusing on debt, austerity, and tax. We need to raise awareness and advocate for an increase in the 4 S's of the budget: the share, size, sensitivity, and scrutiny. Governments must resist the ideology of austerity and privatization and invest urgently in public sector workers, especially doctors, nurses, teachers, and care workers. We need to be building societies and economies that care for both people and the planet. Thank you very much. And now I will stop sharing and I will invite Dennis Sinyolo. Dennis Sinyolo will be presenting on Teachers Union's efforts to press for more domestic funding of public education and tax justice. Dennis is an education expert, researcher, and Africa Director of Education International, the global organization of teachers. Dennis, over to you.
Thank you very much, Maria. Good morning, good afternoon, good evening, colleagues, depending on where you are. As already indicated, I'm speaking on behalf of the 32.5 million members of Education International. Maria has covered a lot of things, but being a teacher myself, I believe in the value of revision. So we will touch on some of the issues she has touched, but I'll probably explain them differently or in addition to what she has already indicated from a teacher's perspective. Just to recall that in 2015, our governments committed to ensure equitable, inclusive, quality education for all, right from early childhood education, guaranteeing at least 1 year of early childhood education for every boy and girl. They refused to put the word free. We wanted free there. And then at least they agreed to the provision of free primary and secondary education of at least 12 years, which is also compulsory. And we wanted free for tertiary education, meaning technical vocational education and training, TVET plus higher education. They settled for affordable. But if you look at progress, in 2019, EI, Education International, carried out an evaluation of the progress that had been achieved concerning SDG 4, and the results were disappointing. One clear message from those results: the world was off track to achieving SDG 4 by 2030. Now, we have had the unfortunate devastation of our education systems, including fatalities by COVID-19. So the targets, which are already being missed in 2019, will obviously be widely missed Going back to that evaluation we did in 2019, the biggest bottleneck to achieving progress was lack of education financing, basically domestic financing. Why? Simply because, as already indicated, domestic financing constitutes 97% of all resources for education, and development aid only 3%. So if we're to make progress, we should actually focus on domestic financing. How can we get more money into education and get that money to reach our students, our educators on the ground? I would like to propose 3 keys for unlocking more domestic funding for education. Like I've said, it may sound like repetition, but I'm approaching it a little bit differently. First of all, governments must meet the global commitments to financing education. That's fundamental. You're probably familiar with these benchmarks, which were adopted in 2015. They were not new, they were always there before 2015, for governments to invest at least 15 to 20% of the national budget, or at least 4 to 6% of GDP in education. Now, previously, before 2015, the minimum benchmark was 20% and 6%. Having participated in those negotiations myself, we had an unfortunate situation where developed countries such as Japan and many countries in Europe and North America said, wait a minute, we don't need to invest the minimum of 20% or 6% of GDP. We have an aging population, so let's have a range. So the range would accommodate us at 15% and developing countries at 20%. That's how that came about. We fought to get at least, some people were saying it's not good English to say at least 15 to 20%. It's not about English, it was about the principle. We fought to keep at least so that that becomes the minimum. We don't then say if you're investing between 15 and 20, you're okay. It's the minimum. Therefore, the minimum for developing countries should in reality be 20% or 6% of GDP. So what we're saying is that many developing countries that are lagging behind in terms of progress towards achieving SDG 4 by 2030 need to invest at least 20% or 6% of GDP in education. As we've heard, the average is disappointing. Globally, currently, according to UNESCO's Global Education Monitoring Report, governments are investing 4.4% of GDP globally. So it's not 6%, the minimum. In Africa, for example, African countries are investing 16.8% of the total public budget in education, not 20%. So my argument is that governments must really, especially developing countries, move that 4.4% to minimum 6%, that's 16.8% to minimum 20%. That would yield significant resources for education, which would then be invested, of course, in education infrastructure, but also, more importantly, in teachers and other education workers. Now, the second key is to grow the size of the budget cake through fair and progressive taxation. Now, you may have a situation, in fact, we have it, where some countries are meeting the minimum benchmark, talk of Senegal, for example, but still they don't have enough resources for education simply because their GDP is small, for example. What if you can then grow the size of the GDP or grow the size of the overall public budget of the country? So the consequence of that would then be more resources or a bigger slice for education and other public services, for example. So just to repeat, by way of emphasis, simple steps like fighting corruption. It may not be simple, it's always hard, but it takes political will. Our governments must fight corruption so that the money which is being hemorrhaged or lost should actually get to the schools, universities, colleges, and so on, and of course our hospitals and other public services. That is fundamental. Of course, it's important to also deal with tax avoidance, to deal with tax evasion, to deal with tax holidays. It's also important to grow the GDP, tax to GDP ratio, as already indicated. This is fundamental. It can help yield significant resources for education. And then key number 3 is to actually address the conditionalities and policies of international financial institutions. We've already heard examples of the policies of the IMF, but also those of the World Bank. Quite often they give advice to governments, but the governments take the advice to be a prescription, simply because if that advice is ignored, it has consequences on the overall economy of the country in terms of the reporting from the World Bank, for example. Now, the conditionalities of the IMF, including caps on public expenditure, caps on salaries of teachers and other education workers, having a big blow on the ability of governments to raise resources for public services and for education in particular. So we are seeing challenges in several countries, whether Senegal, whether Malawi, Nepal, and others, where there is evidence that, in fact, these conditions have been put on governments, urging governments to freeze, for example, public expenditure or hiring new teachers or public sector workers. EI is carrying out, in collaboration with ActionAid, a study to better understand these impacts in Malawi, Senegal, Zambia, Nepal, and we hope by October or so we will have the initial results, which will help us to better respond to the challenges. And finally, I just want to share with you briefly one of our campaigns, which we call the Global Response to Privatization and Commercialization of Education. Through this campaign, we are challenging those who are privatizing public education, including international school chains, who provide the so-called low-cost private schools. In fact, those schools are costly to poor families. These include one school chain, which is operating in some African countries, called Bridge International Academies. We have taken action in Kenya, in Uganda. We've taken action in Ghana. We've taken action in Liberia and elsewhere with good success. For example, in Kenya and Ghana, the governments have taken action, and that has actually clipped the activities of Bridge there. We still continue to deal with those issues. Bridge is still there. We need to do more. So, colleagues, just to conclude, it's indeed a challenge posed by COVID-19, but even before COVID-19, it's clear that on current trends, SDG 4 will not be achieved by 2030. But there are prospects, there are opportunities. We can't continue to hear that governments are poor and they have money when they have enormous resources, whether minerals or otherwise, to actually leverage in order to get more money for public services. Certainly, tax justice, fair taxation is absolutely important. So fighting privatization, but at the same time, putting pressure on governments to take legislative and concrete measures to allocate more money to education, to collect more revenues, and ensure that a good share of that goes to public services is absolutely essential. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Dennis. That was a great presentation. We'll be taking questions at the end of the panel, but please do write them down in the live button so we can just read them and take them at the end. So without much further ado, I would like to introduce you to Evelyn Kabenge-Muendo. She will be presenting on the budget tracking for education in Senegal and Zambia. Evelyn is a legal officer at the East African Tax and Governance Network, and since 2020, she has been working with the Tax and Education Alliance with national partners to increase advocacy on how improved tax policies can increase resources for education financing. Over to you, Evelyn.
Thank you. Thank you so much, Maria. So allow me to share my screen for the purposes of this presentation. And don't worry, it will be a very brief. Can everyone see my screen? Okay, thank you. So let me go to the first one. We've, as the Tax Justice Network Africa, we've done quite a bit of work as part of the Tax Education Alliance on trying to show the impact of fiscal policies and tax policies specifically on education financing. So my presentation will mostly focus on Zambia because with Senegal, we're still collecting some of that data and therefore at this time it's not shareable. But I just wanted to give everyone a general overview of how education financing has been, let me minimize this, sorry, of how education financing has been taking place in Zambia in the past few years. So firstly, Zambia has been under several political commitments, several regional and international commitments. The first one is the Dakar one, which required that at least 7% of the GDP is allocated to education within 5 years, and 9% within 10 years. And then recently, of course, the Incheon Declaration, which was adopted in 2015, which, as the previous speaker has properly given context on, required 20% of the annual budget be allocated towards education. So in this table here, we can see that for the most part, Zambia has not been able to abide by these requirements. It hasn't been able to abide by these regional and international standards of budgetary allocations towards education. And then even more concerning is the gendered impact of insufficient allocation towards education in Zambia. And as you can see here, the gender inequality index showed that 39.2% of adult women have reached secondary level education. Only 39.2% of women have reached secondary level education. So this shows that there's definitely more work that is needed in this particular sector and that more resources is required for education financing in Zambia. And therefore, as has been mentioned by the previous speakers, one of the most sustainable ways of increasing resources for education in Zambia, as can be shown in this graph, is through tax. Tax revenue is the greatest contributor of revenue in Zambia, as can be shown in the past 5 years. If anything, it's actually the contribution of tax towards revenue is actually increasing. And therefore, we need to look at how Zambia can continue to increase its capacity to finance education and what exactly within the tax policies of Zambia are making it difficult or are frustrating the process of increasing domestic resources for education. And I just want to leave everyone with a bit of I won't call it a fun fact, but a fun fact, between 2010 and 2012, Zambia lost approximately $1.919 billion US. And these are resources that could have catered for education and health in 2011. They amounted to 9% of the country's total GDP. So therefore, Zambia is losing a considerable amount of resources because of illicit financial flows. It's losing a considerable amount of resources because of what we may call weak tax policies. that allow for such illicit financial flows. So we also looked at exactly how illicit financial flows are affecting domestic resource mobilization in Zambia. And as a country that is endowed with a lot of mineral resources compared to some of its neighboring countries within its region, it's expected that Zambia will collect a lot of tax revenue from mining specifically. But because of issues such as tax incentives which aren't based on any cost-benefit analysis, and incentives which are given mainly for political reasons rather than sound economic reasons, as well as the mismanagement of the government when it comes to managing public resources, as well as the impact of privatization within the mining sector, there's the expected resources that were to come from mineral resources are not up to par. And I provide a brief case study within the slides showing how multinational companies in Zambia, multinational companies specifically within the mining sector, are really taking advantage of certain tax avoidance practices, especially within transfer pricing. And also we talk about in the last point that if Zambia had managed to close the loopholes within its tax policies between 1998 and 2011, mining tax revenue would have increased to a potential of $6 million compared to the 1 million that was actually raised within that period. So some of the solutions and some of the recommendations that we think can be implemented and effected, some of the things that we would like to see is firstly that there really needs to be a review of the tax incentives that are provided to multinational corporations. And one thing that really stands out about Zambia is the lack of any reports on tax expenditures. Now, tax expenditures really help the government as well as other stakeholders to see what they have actually lost through the opportunity cost, ideally, of providing such tax incentives and really the effectiveness of such tax incentives and exemptions to investors, because the basis for providing these incentives is normally that it attracts foreign direct investment, that it increases employment and other benefits. So the fact that these tax expenditures are not often published and are not publicly accessible is a concern and something that definitely needs to be dealt with within the national tax policy of Zambia. The other thing is that a lot of times tax policies are not weighed against the actual impact, against the social impact that they have on citizens. So we propose that what needs to happen is that there needs to be a child right impact assessment that is done, a social impact assessment that is done, also a gender impact assessment that is done on how such tax policies actually affect the citizens of Zambia and the ability of the country to raise resources for socioeconomic spending. And also the other thing is we are pushing for improved international transparency standards to address illicit financial flows. The other day as a Tax Justice Network Africa, we actually had a webinar in which we were discussing some of the new global the proposals for global taxation reforms, for instance, the G7 agreement, and just our position as African countries and how exactly it will affect us. So we need to push for solutions that actually are convenient and suit the needs of African countries. And the other thing that is quite important, especially in this discussion to do with fiscal policies and how exactly they impact human rights, is that we need to implement the United Nations guiding principles on business and human rights, child rights, and business principles with a specific context, and that is of the impact of taxation on children's rights as well as on the right to education specifically. Also, in light of the COVID-19 pandemic, within tax policies, we also need to adapt innovative solutions. For instance, one solution that has really stood out, one innovative solution that has really stood out that has been propagated by academics such as Professor Atia Waris is the issue of using solidarity taxes in the face of the COVID-19 pandemic. One of the specific socioeconomic sectors that have suffered the most since the COVID-19 pandemic is education. And we should really consider introducing solidarity taxes aimed particularly at persons whom we will call the winners of the COVID-19 pandemic, multinational corporations that have actually made more money because of the circumstances of the pandemic rather than lose that money. Therefore, introducing such an solidarity taxes which would be imposed on, for instance, wealth specifically, as well as income, so as to make sure that they are more progressive, would increase in the short term some of the resources that are needed for education financing. So thank you very much. And that is the end of my presentation.
Brilliant. Thank you very much, Evelyn, for such a wonderful presentation. Now, I would like to introduce Yandura Chipeta, who will be presenting on the bedrock of inclusion, financing inclusive education. Yandura Chipeta is Head of Business Development at ActionAid Malawi. She is an avid feminist, activist, and upcoming policy analyst. Over to you, Yandura.
Thank you so much, Maria. I will be presenting on a study that ActionAid undertook, which is entitled Bedrock of Inclusion, why investing in the education workforce is critical to the delivery of Sustainable Development Goal number 4. I think the previous presenters have already highlighted why financing of public services is crucial to delivery of gender-responsive public services, and that can only be sustainably done through progressive taxation. And sorry, Maria. Thank you so much.
So can you see the notes, or can you just see the slides?
I can see the notes will come up as well.
Yeah. Do you want it to be presented like this, or do you just want to see the slides?
Just the slides.
We can only see the slide.
You can only see the slides. Okay, so that's...
And maybe the next one will be different, but for now we can only see the slide.
Okay. Let's see how...
All right.
You need me to change something, Yandura? I will.
Okay, go to the next one. So I inserted this picture deliberately just to remind ourselves of the need why we are here, and it is because of the children that are in school, and these are the future of the countries, of the nation, and our service and our advocacy is to ensure that they get the best public services, and in this particular case, the best quality of education that a nation can offer its citizens. And this study was conducted as a multi-country study in Malawi, in Tanzania, and Mozambique, and I'll focus mainly on the Malawi report. And mainly it's premised on Sustainable Development Goal number 4, to see what commitments Malawi has made and how it's implementing those commitments in order to ensure inclusive and equitable public education. And it was a desk review. So there were consultations, particularly reading through government documents, the National Education Sector Investment Plan, and the National Strategy on Inclusive Education. And the study also comprised a qualitative component where there were one-on-one interviews with key informants. And Asmara, and this picture here highlights one of the classrooms learning session taking place in Chipeta, which is one of the remotest districts in Malawi. This is in Intalire, and it's closer to Tanzania and Zambia than to the central part of the country. So in relation to the key findings of this study, we found out that despite Malawi having a number of children, particularly 612, who have a disability and are supposed to be in school, but the current enrollment only indicates that 70% of the children living with disability remain out of school. So the schools have only been able to capture 30% of those children. And despite the fact that commitments have been made globally and nationally using policies and legal commitments, implementation of inclusive education remains a great challenge in the country. So Malawi uses a twin track approach in that it provides for mainstream schools which promote inclusive education, and it also has special needs schools where there are resource centers to provide additional learning and tutoring to learners with disability. And in 2017, from the 140 primary schools and 37 secondary school resource centers, we can actually see that these resource centers are only catering, one resource center is only catering to 1,039 children. And that shows the lack of resource centers, particularly in terms of infrastructure, as well as the teaching and learning materials needed. And these resource centers are not adequately financed and resources, and that provides for a lack of quality teaching and learning that is taking place. And the study also found that teachers lack knowledge and skills. So there are limitations in relation to teacher capacity to deliver inclusive education. And coupled with that, as a country, Malawi has registered the biggest teacher shortages in the world. And that makes it even more difficult for teachers to deliver in inclusive environments, so that both learners should be able to get the adequate service that is needed. There are a lack of assistive devices for learners that need such equipment in schools, and in most schools, infrastructure is inaccessible and also inadequate. So those are some of the key highlights and major challenges. Malawi as a country has a recommended qualified teacher ratio of 60:1. So one teacher should teach about 60 pupils, but that is not the case. We have a teacher shortage of around 82,461 in order for us to reach that recommended ratio. So that means it's even more difficult for a teacher who is teaching. The current national rate is at 1 to 70, but in other districts across the country, it goes as high as 1 to 89, and in others 1 to 100. So in such types of classrooms, it's very difficult for a teacher to effectively deliver in inclusive learning. And we can also see that the workforce training is also an area that has limitation. And Malawi's teacher training curriculum only was revised in 2007. And since then up to now, there has never been another revision. And if we look at the changing context globally and locally, we need to ensure that the teacher training curriculum adjusts to the current needs and changes. But that is not possible if the government does not have adequate finances available to do such reviews and introduce a curriculum that fits the changing context. And the 2007 reforms that occurred were donor-led and donor-supported. And despite the fact that government has invested in the sector, we still see 100 teachers graduating yearly, and these are specialist teachers who have been trained in special needs education and have earned a 3-year diploma. And these teachers are then sent to schools at zonal level. And one teacher supports sometimes 6 and others 10 schools to ensure that the government is promoting special needs education and inclusive education, and there is inclusive learning taking place, which is quite difficult for one teacher to be able to do and reach out to the learners that really require that support. And we have seen government introducing a compulsory module in the teacher training centers for primary school teachers on inclusive education. But the content that has been reviewed of that module appears limited in relation to handling issues of inclusive education. And our annual budget analysis, and in particular the 2018 national budget, had no funds allocated for continuous professional development, which is key to the provision of quality and inclusive education. So in relation to financing, ActionAid has estimated that in the 2016-2017 national budget, only 100 million kwacha, which is 136,000 United States dollar, was allocated to inclusive education, which in this particular case is termed special needs education. And that only represents 0.03%. And we have seen this trend continuing across the years, in that the allocations are not going high. And we have seen government on paper making commitments to finance inclusive education in the national strategy for inclusive education, but this has not translated into concrete budget allocations. And the costing model also in relation to inclusive education has a lot to be desired, in that we see that it fails to account for teacher recruitment, which is needed in order to ensure that Malawi is able to deliver quality and inclusive education. And we have seen government that it plans to train 35,000 teachers, which is good, but the amount of funds allocated to that training raises a lot of serious questions of feasibility, as it translates to $10 to train one teacher in inclusive education, which is nearly impossible. So we may see that government will train teachers, but not the 35,000 that they commit to train. So despite progress and investment in the education sector, particularly to ensure inclusion and equity and promote access to all children, but resources remain insufficient to deliver inclusive education. And the resources can only be gotten through progressive taxation. And we have seen year in, year out that Malawi continues to allocate a good proportion of its national budget and GDP to the education sector. However, the funds remain insufficient if you look at the need in the sector. And we have seen in the 2019-2020 budget, Malawi allocating 23.5% of the national budget to the education sector, which is equivalent to 6.3%. And that has been continued. The 2020-2021 national budget is at around 22%. And we're still going beyond the 20% allocation, but the need in the schools remains greater. And one thing that from the studies that ActionAid has undertaken is that there are insufficient revenue collection, which is providing limitations to the collection of domestic revenue to fund inclusive education and public services. And from the studies that we have done, we have seen that harmful tax incentives that are granted to multinational corporations contribute to the hampering of revenue collection. Outdated double taxation agreements with developed countries also pose a risk to potential revenue that the country can generate. Illicit financial flows contribute to potential revenue loss. And through our different studies, we have made recommendations to government. We have engaged with government in order to initiate reforms that should be able to push our GDP further. And through that, government would be able to get at most 135 million US dollars as an estimate. And if only government could allocate 20% of that potential revenue that is lost, it could translate to 27 million US dollars, which could pay for at least 12,000 teachers in the schools where government is providing education. And the picture that you can see is a common thing in Malawi where classes occur outside the classroom. So that's a classroom. That's because Malawi has issues in relation to infrastructure. And when it's very sunny, it means there's no learning that will take place. And when it's raining, that's even worse. There's no learning that will take place. So let alone inclusive learning and education. That is why we keep on talking about the need for progressive taxation in order to address the challenges that are there in the education sector. And if we look at SDG 4 or the Sustainable Development Goal Agenda 2030, we're only 9 years to reach 2030. But there is a lot that needs to be done. And COVID-19 has just come in and made the situation worse, as our schools are already congested. But government needs to relook and rethink in terms of tightening the leaking buckets in relation to the potential areas that are leading to revenue loss in the country. So one of the areas that in relation to the study that we made, we are calling upon the government of Malawi and African governments to safeguard the finances in the education sector and invest in the education workforce as well as the education sector in order to deliver quality public education for all children, including children with disabilities. And this can only be done by increasing the size of the overall national budget through progressive tax reforms and spending at least 20% of the budget, which is 6% of the GDP on education, and going beyond the minimum would actually support our governments to improve in the quality of public education that is delivered, and that governments should address the amounts that are lost each year to debt servicing. With the incoming of COVID, we are actually also seeing government borrowing a lot more. And Malawi, for example, in this year alone, we have seen the spiraling of debt, and the current national budget, we are seeing government allocating 24% of the budget to debt repayment. And that money could have supported the education sector and other public services. And if government would have generated the revenue that it is losing as a result of archaic DTAs and tax laws and harmful tax incentives, we could not have been borrowing, because we could have generated the sufficient revenue that is required in order for government to continue functioning and providing quality public services. And we're also calling upon governments to ensure that funds allocated to education arrive timely where they are needed. And in the next slide, we are seeing school children in one of the remote districts in Malawi, in Neno. They are happy children and they have a hope for the future. They think that government can be able to provide quality education in order for them to become the next leaders of tomorrow. And I will leave you with one quote, and that was said by Nelson Mandela. And it says, education is the most powerful weapon which you can use to change the world. Education changes people and people change the world. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Yandura. Really good presentation, great presentation. So now I would like to invite all the speakers who can do it. Probably, Yandura, you cannot do it, but to put your video on, your camera on. And we are going to start with the Q&A session, the questions. So far, I can see one question from Liz Nelson, and she is asking, what should governments be doing in terms of taxation to minimize the gender gap in education, which has been exacerbated as a result of the pandemic, emphasizing traditional gender roles, care role, for instance? Who would like to answer that question? Who would like to start? Shall we start in the order that we were doing the presentations? Dennis, would you like to go ahead?
Yes, sure. Just to reiterate that it's important, of course, to grow the size of the budget and to allocate adequate funding to public services, in this case, where I'm coming from, to education. So it's a question of, first and foremost, the overall size of the budget and its allocation to education. Now, if we have money in education, now the next question would be, how is that money allocated to ministries? But within the education ministry, how is that money being earmarked as necessary to address issues of gender, for example? Now, there are several things that can be done at that level. First of all, it's important to provide second chance programs for girls who drop out of school, maybe because of pregnancy or other reasons. It could be early marriage. Let's allow them to come back to school. And those programs are absolutely essential, even if it may mean earmarking money to make that happen. And then, of course, it's also important to ensure the recruitment, in the first instance, training, and then recruitment and allocation of more female teachers, especially to rural schools. In many African schools, for example, you would find less female teachers in rural areas. As you go higher, for example, to secondary school level, the situation gets worse. And it's also because of the environmental factors, lack of housing, for example, lack of transport, electricity. Those factors tend to impact women, of course, men as well, but also lack of health facilities. So it's important that governments ensure that we have enough female teachers who can also act as role models for girls, to inspire more girls actually to want to achieve something, to achieve education and become a somebody. They need role models, but also because girls have unique needs, which can only be addressed by female teachers. Of course, male teachers can help, but those unique needs will need female teachers. Third, it's important to also ensure that we have women who are promoted, enough women are promoted to leadership positions. And finally, it's important to close the gender pay gap. You may say, but do women receive less than men? In some instances, yes, it's indirect sometimes. For example, in early childhood education, over 90% of the teachers are female. But as you go to secondary and tertiary education, university, it's the reverse. Now, the consequence of that is that in tertiary education, the salaries are higher, generally speaking, than in early childhood education. So the majority who are in the lower sectors of education, being women, are paid less. So if we then ensure that our education systems are equitable at all levels, then that would help us close the gender pay gap. Thanks.
Thank you very much, Dennis. Evelyn, would you like to go next?
Yes, thank you, Maria, and thank you, Dennis, for your comments. So I'll really just build off on some of the comments that have already been made. I think if countries haven't already done so, gender responsive budgeting is something that really needs to be adopted. And Dennis has mentioned a very important thing, method which can also be used, which is earmarking taxes specifically for gender responsive programs within the education sector. So I think that's very, very important, particularly in the times that we lived in. COVID-19 has had a serious impact even in my own country, in Kenya, where we've seen such a high rate of girls dropping out because of issues such as pregnancies. And sometimes, actually in a lot of these instances, these pregnancies are coming about because of sexual assault. Therefore, the education sector really needs to provide programs that are gender responsive and that are responsive to the needs of these girls in these areas. And if necessary, we need to adopt innovative mechanisms like earmarking specific taxes for the purposes of funding these programs. Yeah.
That's great. Thank you very much, Evelyn. Yandura, would you like to respond as well?
Yes, please. A lot has already been said by the two panelists, but just to add the fact that apart from issues of taxation and revision of tax laws and DTAs in order for governments to generate the revenue that is needed for public expenditure and public service provision, there is need for enactment of laws and formulation of policies to ensure gender equality and women's empowerment, and through those being costed as well, so that the revenue that is generated should be able to be used in programs that will enhance gender equality and women's empowerment, including in schools, particularly looking at targeting girls, and also the curriculum being gender responsive and empowering in order to ensure that the traditional gender roles are challenged and critiqued, so that learners and women in communities should know that they're capable of excelling and also contributing to economic development in their communities. In light of COVID, what is also key is investment in the health sector to ensure that the burden of the care role is not placed on citizens, but rather on the health facilities, so that those that need that kind of support should be able to get the support needed within the health facilities. Yes, thank you very much.
That's great. And thank you very much, Yandura. And I will abuse my position as a moderator because I was also presenting to try to answer as well that question. And I think it is important, as I was presenting before, to be looking at both, at the expenditure, but also in terms of the revenues. So in terms of the revenues, we know that taxes are gender biased, particularly at the moment. That we know that when there is not enough collected through taxes, there is not enough to spend on public services. So both the way that taxes are, that the tax system is done has an effect, particularly on women, particularly on the poorest sectors of society. So that's why we need progressive taxation, and we need to be taxing properly those that are richest, particularly multinational companies. And we have already been talking about tax evasion and tax avoidance. Now, having enough resources and enough revenue to pay for public services, and as we were talking before, it's not only about education, it's also having enough money to pay for good health services, for care services as well. Because what we see is that when these services are not good and are not free, then households have to make decisions, particularly poorest households have to prioritize certain people within their family. When education is not free, and it's not free in any of the countries that we were talking about, because there are a lot of user fees that actually exclude the poorest sections of society, families tend to choose the firstborn male without disabilities. So if you are a girl in that family, you might be like the second option in that sense. So first, all these services need to be available. They need to be close by. So these girls don't need to be relying on transport, on bodas, on motorcycles that could cost money and could take them away from education. So these girls can be accessing education without having to pay user fees. So those girls don't need to be looking after relatives, looking after their little siblings as well. So all these things are very important. Many girls miss out on education because of not being able to afford sanitary products as well. So when they have their period, they don't go to school. All these things need to be taken into account when we are budgeting, when we are making tax reforms in that sense, because they have real consequences in this sense. And just to conclude, I would like to say that I think that this panel brings this great coordination in terms of how much we can gain when we are talking about tax justice, and we are linking it to public services, particularly education, which is something that we all care about. So rather than being something abstract and just being the domain of technocrats, we can make tax justice being a very empowering issue when we link it to education, when we link it to the financing of education, because for people in education for too long, they have been putting up with the narrative of there is not enough money. Just giving free education to everyone is too expensive, but it is not too expensive because we know that large amounts of money are being given away. They're just like going without being used for these public services that we really need. So I would like to thank again all the panelists and everyone for your attention, and carry on enjoying this last day of the Tax Justice Network conference. Thank you very much for TJN to provide this platform. Thank you.